Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, the Riverside Brethren, for inviting me to speak today. And I'd like also to thank very much our dear brother Adam for his discourse, of which points us in the direction of the subject that I would like to deal with, and that, of course, is Israel. Brother Jolly told us, I can't remember if it now was 1964 or 1968, he told the brethren to watch out for two things. One was Rome and the papacy, and the other was Israel and what was happening in Israel. I'd like to concentrate now in this discourse to that of Israel. So today we'll be examining the prophecy made by the prophet Ezekiel in the 37th chapter, verses 1 to 14. So if you would be so kind to turn to those scriptures so that we can look at them in more detail as we go through this discourse. It's a very large subject, as Brother Adam indicated in his talk. And so it is true with what I'm going to be dealing with is the dry bones of Israel. So who was the prophet Ezekiel? We believe he was a married man. We understand that his wife had died sometime earlier during the siege of Jerusalem. He was a man of great faith, especially in the leadership of Israel, even though when you examine the time of which this was wrote, things weren't going very well for Israel or for the prophet. So when the fall of Jerusalem took place, it would have been a great shock to Ezekiel. Making things worse, of course, I think that he would still have been mourning the death of his wife. And if that wasn't bad enough, I'm sure him seeing the enemies of Israel marching his people off into captivity. So just about everything in the prophet's life was going wrong. He may have been wondering how the promises of God's blessing could be fulfilled in his people who were going into captivity. And how did this fit in God's plan for his people, the nation of Israel? It's very much, I suppose, really like Christians might be feeling today when we consider what is happening in the world, especially what is happening in Europe, in the Ukraine and so forth, and how the nations are now just falling into disarray. One day, it appears that God spoke to him, probably when he was feeling at a very low point, when God showed to him via a vision a valley that was full of bones, bleached white in the sun. In the vision, it seems that the skeletons had laid there for some considerable time. It was as if there'd been a massive battle had taken place and the dead had never been buried. So let's have a look at these scriptures. I'll be reading it from the King James Version. So beginning at verse 1, it says, "The hand of Jehovah was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of Jehovah, and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he caused me to pass by them around about, and behold, they were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord Jehovah, thou knowest." In other words, what the prophet here was saying back to Jehovah that he could not answer the question which Jehovah had put to him, but he knew that Jehovah himself knew the answer. So the scene really was set for the prophet as he saw these dusty, dry desert, where it appears these bones were scattered in all directions, and there wasn't a complete skeleton amongst them. The bones themselves were all mixed up, scattered all over the place. Verse 4 says, "Again he said unto me, prophesy over these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of Jehovah." Verse 5, "Thus saith the Lord Jehovah unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and you will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. And you shall know that I am Jehovah." It's interesting the way in which this is Jehovah speaking here, that because he's saying that whatever these events are taking place, whenever they are, that Israel themselves, the people, would know that it was Jehovah that was causing it to happen. Verse 7, "So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, an earthquake, and the bones came together, bone to its bone." So this coming together of these bones appears to have order, creating complete human skeletons that could be recognized. Verse 8, "And I beheld, and lo, there were sinews upon them, and flesh came up, and the skin covered them from above, but there was no breath in them." Verse 9, "Then he said unto me, prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, Thus say the Lord Jehovah, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." These scriptures sound familiar to you, brethren? They should do, because Jesus quotes them in the book of Revelation. Verse 10, "So I prophesied as it commanded me, and the breath came unto them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army." Verse 11, "Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are clean cut off." This appears to be the thoughts of those who did not realize that God's people, the nation of Israel, would live again. Verse 12, "Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Behold, I will open your graves, and cause you to come up out of them, of your graves. O my people, I will bring you into the land of Israel." Verse 13, "And you shall know that I am Jehovah, when I open your graves and cause you to come out of your graves, O my people." And our final verse here, "And I will put my spirit in you, and you shall live. And I will place you in your own land, and you shall know that I, Jehovah, have spoken it and performed it, saith Jehovah." So the prophecy itself seems to cover a long period of time. In fact, what he was seeing here was centuries into the future. Only Jehovah can predict the future. So it's very clear that the great Jehovah himself is showing in this prophecy to the prophet something which would take place centuries in the future. Now, this wasn't a scattering that he was experiencing at that time, but it was looking at a time when a greater diaspora would take place well into the future, which he could not have recognized or understood. And whenever this was to happen, that Israel would witness as a nation and would fully recognize that it was Jehovah that was performing it. Now, this is important, that the nation of Israel are actually recognizing what is taking place. So when did this prophet witness this vision? Well, we believe that his missionary was conducted mainly in Jerusalem and then in Babylon in the first 3 decades of the 6th century BC. Longer, the prophet warned the people of the destruction of Jerusalem and the restoration of the nation in his time, which was true. And of course, he was seeing the destruction of the first temple. The question has to be, as far as Bible students ourselves, why was it in the valley and why were the bones so dry? A valley here seems to denote that it was in a time when God's favor was no longer with the nation of Israel. No longer were they on God's mountain and receiving God's favor, but deep into a valley where it was very hot, very dry, where there was no water. That's what you get in deserts. In other words, there was no truth that was now available to them as a nation, which they'd been having all the time in which they were in favor with God, even though they were often in trouble in their various breakaways periods when they went into disfavor. The reason the bones were scattered there denotes that as a nation, they no longer resembled a nation at all, no longer was seen as the nation which God had been dealing with. So the bones laid there for many centuries until the time came when God's favor once again would be with them. Near Jerusalem, it's thought that the ancient tomb contains the bodies of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, along with Sarah and Rebecca. The tomb was discovered several years ago beneath a massive building, revealing artifacts from the early Israelite period. The structure was built during the Second Temple period, about 2,000 years ago, by Herod the Great, who was at that time providing a place for gathering of the Jews to prayer at the graves of these patriarchs. And for nearly 4,000 years, those bones rested on the hope of a resurrection. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, the area fell into the hands of the Israeli Defense Force. And you remember that man, he was a general at that time, Moshe Dayan. He was also the defense minister. He was also an amateur archaeologist. He attempted to regain access into these tombs where the bones of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so forth were in. He was only partially successful in gaining entrance, but that's another story. Now, remembering Jesus's words that he spoke to the clerics of his time when he told them that the day would come when they would see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they would not be a part of that plan or that class which God would have been putting together when they were resurrected. And so Jerusalem, its bones dried and scattered, bones dead for nearly 2,000 years, bones resting on the hope, or only hope, of a resurrection. For centuries, these bones have laid with no signs of life in them. And yet the prophecy tells us a completely different story. So the Bible doesn't seem to agree with our friends in the society that say that Israel or the nation of Israel have no part in God's plan for the future. No, this prophecy says that they have a complete one. And I think as Brother Adam was saying, the central point of when the kingdom is established will be through that nation and through their representatives of people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth. So the day is coming when these bones will one day fully be revived in a new form, that God says he would give them a body pleasing unto him, the likes that we have never seen before. Since the twin destruction of Jerusalem under the mighty armies of the Roman generals Titus and Hadrian, the Jewish people entered into a long period of dispersion, generally known today as the diaspora. In their national hopes, like those bones in the ancient graves deep in the valley of Kidron, have been dead. They have been dry bones, bones with little hope of ever reviving. They have been scattered bones, scattered to the four corners of the earth, a people dispersed from almost every country in the world, with only one common hope, one common bond, that one day they will be back in Jerusalem. Nearly all their prayers started that way. Next year in Jerusalem. These bones have been completely cut off. And as the prophet Hosea says, without a king, without a prince, without a sacrifice, without an image, without an ephod, they were left scattered. But what caused that national scattering? Jesus answers this question when he says in Matthew 23, verses 37, 39, which I'm sure that all of you know well. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth, till you shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Their favor ended, we believe, in AD 36. And by AD 70, another of those anchor dates, remember I talked last year about anchor dates. These are dates that have an event attached to them. So we know that we're solid with them. AD 70 is one of these. When the Roman general Titus later became, you remember, an emperor, he laid siege to Jerusalem. Now that siege began, we understand, around about the 14th of April, AD 70, 3 days before the beginning of the Passover for that year. The siege itself lasted about 5 months. It ended in August of AD 70 with the burning and the destruction of the Second Temple. And from that time on, the Jewish people never had the promised land. But we notice what Jesus says when he prophesies that their house will be desolate. He says the word until. That's the key to it. Until, which can only mean that there was a time limit and a condition that nation would be required to meet for that favor to come back to them. What was the condition? As a nation, they would have to recognize the one whom they have pierced and mourn for him as they mourn for their only son. Could this event ever take place? Well, the powers that be, all the nations around it said, no, this can't happen. No country which has ever lost its homeland has ever regained it down through history, be the Babylonians or anybody else. Nobody has ever happened. The military people say, no, these bones can never live again. Yet God says, you remember in that 10th verse, I will make of you a great army. Yes, Israel today is the most powerful armed forces in the Middle East. All coming true. Why are they the most powerful? Because God says that he would fight for them as he did in the days of battle. Brother Jolly tells us that in the War of Independence, God was fighting for them. And that is why they're the most powerful forces in the Middle East today. He fought for them, and we see in 1948 when they became the state of Israel. You would have thought, you know, that such an important date of 1948 would have been indicated in the Bible. Well, maybe it was. I think Brother Jack was saying in the question meetings that God always works on a need-to-know basis. And that's true. It wasn't need to be known. And yet, it may be that in fact it was known, and the Bible did indicate it. We said that the diaspora started in AD 36 when Jesus left their house desolate, and their favor came to an end. But the fulfillment of it was an anchor date of that of AD 70, when Jerusalem was laid siege to, the Second Temple was destroyed, everything was ransacked, and the people were scattered. That was the proof of it. That's a difference of 34 years. Well, if you consider what Brother Russell tells us, and I believe that Brother Russell is right here, that the fulfillment of the Gentile times and the fullness of the Gentile times all ended in 1914. And if you added that 34 years as an anchor date, you come to exactly to the month and to the year of 1948. So maybe the Bible did indicate it, and that at the right time, we came to understand it. So it may have been there that there was the evidence that the state of Israel would be established in 1948. People often say to me, why is it, Brother John, that we don't see miracles like we used to see in the Old Testament, the parting of the sea? My answer to them has always been, next to Jesus' resurrection, the greatest miracle that we have ever witnessed is the nation of Israel being reborn. Reborn to its ancient homeland, reborn against tremendous odds, reborn amidst a vastly outnumbered opposition, reborn and thriving. For over a century, the history of the Middle East has been moving in steady steps toward the fulfillment of this prophecy of Ezekiel. With the fulfillment of their period of disfavor, as far as God was concerned, the Jews were now given permission to own property in the ancient land of their forefathers. In 1878, they immediately established their first settlement, Petchar Tikva, a city near Tel Aviv, which they became for many years, right up to the time of President Trump, their capital, now recognized as Jerusalem, thanks to President Trump. In 1897, Theodor Herzl issued a worldwide call to organize the Zionist movement, which the Israeli government just recently said that they recognized Brother Charles Taze Russell was the greatest Christian Zionist Israel ever had, and that the state of Israel should acknowledge the great work that Brother Russell did for the Zionist movement. In 1917, the government of Great Britain endorsed the Jewish state in the famous Balfour Declaration that they should have a return to their homeland. From 1936 to 1945, over 6 million Jews were killed in the Nazi Holocaust, the most dreadful period in history that was perpetrated against the Jewish nation and the Jewish people. I visited, when I was over in Poland last, to Auschwitz. It is true, it is the most terrible place with terrible memories of what took place there. Now, David Dillon, I don't know, I think many of you might know of his work. He was an American journalist who lived and worked in Jerusalem since the early 1980s. In his book, Israel in Crisis, What Lies Ahead, he tells the readers that he gets many questions dealing with modern Israel's rebirth as a sign that the prophecy of the time of end has come. The one portion of scriptures that he quotes to verify this thought comes in Psalm 102. It's worth turning to that at the moment, brethren. He tells us that after a time of personal study, he came to believe that the particular psalm predicted the Holocaust and the subsequent restoration of Israel and Jerusalem, and that generation that witnessed these events would also be the generation that sees the Lord's coming back to reign in the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, I found that David Dillon, I was on his mailing list for many years. I found he was never dogmatic in anything that his viewpoints he put forward. His general style is of non-controversialism. He simply shares his findings and presents them the best way that he can. He says that the readers can either take it or leave it, and I'll do the same here in dealing with this. I simply want to share this thought that he has with you so that you can reflect upon it in your studies, and I hope you will find them at least interesting, if not useful. So let's turn to Psalm 102, and I'll start with the first 3 verses. This again is from the King James Version. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let me cry unto thee. Hide not thy face from me in the day when I'm in trouble. Incline thy ear unto me. In the day when I call, answer me speedily. For my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned as an hearth. Surely the last line of this passage reminds us of the horrors of the Holocaust and the death camps, where prisoners were thrown into the crematoria. The phrase like smoke, which comes up in the King James Version, as well as many of the other conversions, may not be the best translation. David Dillon argues that in the Young's translation, it would be better translated not like smoke, but in smoke. The Hebrew word for smoke is ashan. Its root word means simply to smoke, either literally or figuratively. Aside from the knowledge of the Hebrew language, the context itself would seem to indicate that in smoke is the preferred translation, if taking the literal viewpoint, which is the primary usage of this Hebrew word. Its figurative use is secondary. Note that the author of the Psalm of 102 says that his bones are burnt, and thus the smoke he refers to is directly related to this event. In other words, his burning bones are the source of the smoke. And so his days are literally consumed in smoke rather than like smoke. The next interesting portion of the Psalm of 102 that leads credibility to Dillon's claim that this portion of scripture describes the Holocaust occurs in verses 4 and 5. Again, I will read it from the King James Version. My heart is smitten and withered like grass, so I forget to eat my bread. By reason of the voice of my groaning, my bones cleave to my skin. According to David, starvation, and he was perfectly correct, was one of the main causes of the death in the German concentration camps. What Hitler tried to do there, and Satan, because that's where it was indicated from, was to destroy God's plan by destroying the nation of Israel. Satan knew if there was no nation of Israel, God's plan would be thwarted. In reality, it did just the opposite. The sympathy of the nations regarding the Holocaust actually hastened the birth of Israel. So in 1948, as a result of the United Nations partition, Israel became a sovereign state once again. Then immediately challenged by the overpowering Arab forces, an Israeli victory legitimized the declaration of that statehood. In 1956, an invasion led by General Nasser of Egypt, which I'm sure you'll remember, was soundly repelled. In 1967, the Six-Day War of Israel against the Arab coalition enlarged the borders of the new state, and Jerusalem was once again under Jewish control. 1973, on the eve of the Jewish High Holy Day of Yom Kippur, a third Arab attack was again set back. In 1989, the dismantled countries of the Soviet Union permitted Jews of the former Soviet Union who had been refused all at that time to able to immigrate to Israel previously were now allowed to go. Now, all of these dates that I've just given to you are anchor dates because they all have an event to it which everybody recognizes. Incidentally, the Russians referred to the Jews at that time that wanted to get back to Israel as the refuseniks, they call them. In the 1990s, surrounded Arab countries continued to attack Israel with both modern weaponry, such as Scud missiles fired by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we all know what happened to him. Jesus, our Lord, had said, those that curse his people, he will curse them. That was certainly true of Saddam and his family. Along with the rise of the terrorist groups in Israel's surrounding countries, such as the PLO, Hamas, Islamic Jihad movements, and a dozen others, have all failed so far to dislodge the Israelites from their homeland. Dry bones returning to life, scattered bones have become regathered bones. Bare bones have assumed sinews and flesh, covered with their bones topped with skin. But are those bones alive? In part 2 of this discourse, which I will give tomorrow, I will answer that question. Has Jehovah breathed life into those bones? So for the time being, may the Lord add his blessing. I added a little bit more to my talk because I knew that Brother Ken had left me an extra 10 minutes. So I think I've finished just about on time. So may the Lord add his blessings. Amen.